true worship happening in self-donation should be similar to what Jesus did. Jesus' sacrifice of life was not focused on himself or his agenda, but rather was his obedient response to the Father who had sent him. The fulfillment of his saving will pleases the Father more than any burnt offerings. Thus, obedience to God makes the gift of self an act of worship. This is the first element of the worship of Jesus in his self-sacrifice. Secondly, his worship includes his solidarity with weak, feeble sinners. In Hebrews 4:15 and 16, it is stated, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace in time of need." The oneness of Jesus with weak humanity was essential to his priestly service or worship on behalf of the people. Hebrews 2:17 and 18 states eloquently, "Therefore he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested." My brothers and sisters, here the image of priestly service or worship is applied to the redemptive mission of Jesus. His embrace of the trials and the sufferings of human beings has made him a brother who can now truly intercede for them before the Father's mercy, instead of judging them harshly. He worships through supplications to the Father, welling up from his compassion for erring sinners. In other words, the prayer, the worship of Jesus to the Father gives voice to humankind's laments, sorrows, and hopes that he has made his very own. In summary, we can say that the worship of Jesus is the sacrifice of his own life, offered to fulfill the Father's will to save sinners, whose weaknesses he shares in order to lift them to the mercy of God as a compassionate high priest and brother. Obedience to God and compassionate action on behalf of sinners form the one unique, unitary act of worship and sacrifice of Jesus. These two aspects cannot be separated from each other. I cannot say, I will focus on obedience and not on compassion. I cannot say, I will focus on compassion but not on obedience. These two come together in the one single act of sacrifice and worship. Ultimately, We see in the worship of Jesus the embodiment of the greatest commandments, loving God with one's whole being and loving one's neighbor as oneself. Every time we come to the Eucharist, Jesus renews his unique sacrifice and invites us to share in his worship of self-offering, done in obedience to the Father and compassion for sinful humanity. In baptism, we have begun sharing in the sacrifice of Jesus, the sacrifice of obedience to the Father in solidarity with sinners. Baptism unites us to the sacrificial death and newness of life of Jesus. That is St. Paul. In union with Christ and in the power of the Holy Spirit, we, baptized, are enabled to offer our lives for God, and that involves dying to sin. Obedience to God involves dying to sin. Renunciation of sin and faith in God form the fundamental worship and sacrifice of the baptized, made possible by our sharing in the sacrifice and worship of Jesus.